There is a 90-second video still sitting in Marcus Delaney's phone that he has watched more times than he can count, and he still cannot get past the 11-second mark without his pulse climbing, even though he knows exactly what happens, even though nothing in the frame ever moves. It's not what's in the video that unsettles him. It's what he knows was standing just outside it, close enough to touch the house, close enough to reach the gutter directly above his head, and never once caught on camera, never once caught in 3 floodlights bright enough to light up a stage, in a yard with nowhere left to hide. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why a man who spent 20 years explaining away every strange sound in other people's houses now can't sit on his own balcony after dark without checking the gutter first. Marcus Delaney had spent the better part of 20 years training himself not to believe in things he couldn't measure. He was 43 years old, worked as a structural inspector for a commercial contracting firm in Asheville, North Carolina, and had built an entire personality around being the guy who ruined ghost stories at parties. Give him a creaking floorboard, and he'd find you the loose joist. Give him a cold spot, and he'd find you the leaky window seal. He didn't believe in an afterlife, didn't believe in energy that lingered after death, and had gone through most of his adult life mildly irritated by people who did. So when he finally tells people what happened to him on the second Thursday of October, the thing he always says first isn't, "I saw a shadow," or "I heard a knock." It's this. Nobody who knew him well would have ever believed he'd be the one telling this story. It started on an ordinary evening, the kind that doesn't announce itself as the beginning of anything. Marcus had just gotten home from a site inspection that ran long, and he was sitting at his dining room table with a plate of reheated pasta, scrolling through his phone, half watching the dark press in against the sliding glass door that led out to his second-floor balcony. His house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, backed up against a stretch of undeveloped woods that the county kept promising to turn into a park and never did. It was the kind of yard that homeowners with a healthy fear of raccoons and deer invested in properly. 3 motion sensor floodlights mounted at different corners of the property, enough wattage between them to make the entire backyard look like a stage set at night. Marcus had installed them himself 2 summers earlier, after a bear sighting 2 streets over convinced half the neighborhood to upgrade their exterior lighting. He was, by his own admission, a man who liked to be able to see things clearly, which was exactly why what happened next left him rattled in a way he wasn't prepared for. He glanced up from his phone toward the sliding door, not because he heard anything, not because some prickling sense of being watched pulled his attention there, but simply because that was where his eyes happened to land as he reached for his water glass. And in the narrow rectangle of glass, moving with a fluidity that didn't match anything he could immediately categorize, was a shape. Not a shadow cast by something, not a trick of a passing cloud over the moon, but a shape that seemed to carry its own darkness with it, gliding across the balcony from left to right, at a height and a pace that made his stomach drop before his brain had even finished processing what his eyes were reporting. It was there for maybe a second and a half, 2 seconds at the outside, and then it was gone, passing beyond the frame of the door as smoothly as it had entered it. And Marcus was left sitting at his table with his fork halfway to his mouth, and his heart doing something uncomfortable in his chest. His first instinct, because he was who he was to explain it away. A bird, a bat, the reflection of a curtain moving somewhere behind him, thrown back at him by the glass. He got up, checked behind him, found nothing that could have produced that reflection, and stood at the sliding door for a long moment, staring out into a backyard that his own floodlights had rendered almost aggressively bright. Nothing moved. No branches swayed. The 2 lawn chairs he kept out there sat exactly where he'd left them. He told himself it was nothing, some misfire of tired eyes after a 12-hour workday, and he went back to his pasta, though he noticed he'd angled his chair slightly so the balcony door stayed in his peripheral vision for the rest of the night. He had no way of knowing yet that the shape in the glass was the smallest, gentlest part of what was coming, or that within 2 weeks he'd have a witness standing beside him to prove he wasn't losing his mind. He didn't mention it to anyone for almost a week. That was, he later realized, the loneliest part of the whole thing. Not the shape itself, but the days afterward when he carried it around like a stone in his pocket, turning it over in his mind at stoplights and during boring conference calls, unable to land on an explanation that satisfied him, and unwilling to say the words out loud to another human being for fear of what saying them would mean about him. It was his cousin Renee who finally got it out of him, and only because she noticed he'd gone quiet during a phone call and pressed him about it until he caved. Renee was 41, ran a small physical therapy practice 2 towns over, and had exactly the kind of no-nonsense practicality that made her the one person Marcus felt safe telling. She didn't gasp or immediately start talking about spirits. She asked good, specific questions. How tall? How fast? What part of the balcony? Was the door locked? Had he been drinking? The way she might ask a patient to describe exactly where the pain was and when it started. And when she'd exhausted her mundane explanations, and Marcus had shot each one down with the specificity of a man who'd been running the same interrogation on himself for a week straight, she said something that surprised him. She said she wanted to come see the balcony for herself. She came over that Saturday evening, ostensibly for dinner, though they both understood the visit had a second purpose neither of them said out loud. They ate on the back deck below the balcony rather than up on it, some unspoken agreement that they weren't quite ready to sit in the exact spot where the shape had passed, and the conversation drifted comfortably away from the subject as the evening wore on, the way conversations do when 2 people have decided not to dwell on something. It was full dark by the time they carried their glasses up to the balcony itself, both of them telling themselves it was just to catch the last of the cooler night air before Renee drove home. The yard below them looked, if anything, brighter than usual. All 3 floodlights were on, triggered at some point by a possum or a low-flying moth, casting the grass and the tree line beyond the fence in a flat, shadowless white that made the idea of anything hiding out there feel almost laughable. Marcus remembers thinking, with something like relief, that nothing could get close to this house without being lit up like a stage actor. He remembers Renee saying something about how his security setup put her own to shame, and he remembers, with a clarity that is never dulled in the retelling, the sound that came immediately after, the sound that would end, forever, any argument either of them might have made for coincidence. 3 knocks. Not a scrape, not the settling creak of gutter metal contracting in the evening cool, but 3 distinct, deliberate raps, evenly spaced, coming from the aluminum gutter that ran along the roofline directly above the section of balcony where they were both standing. The sound had weight to it, the specific hollow resonance of knuckles or something knuckle-like striking metal with intention, and both of them turned toward it at the same instant, which is the detail Marcus circles back to every time he tells the story, because it meant neither of them could have imagined it alone. Renee heard it too. Renee's face confirmed it before either of them said a word. They stood frozen for a moment that felt much longer than it was, staring up at a gutter that ran along a clean, well-lit roofline with absolutely nothing on it. No branch overhanging that section of the house, no wire, nothing that could account for 3 sequential strikes against sheet metal 8 feet above their heads. Marcus's phone was in his hand. He'd been about to take a photo of the yard for an unrelated reason, some passing thought about the way the floodlights caught the tree line. And in the scramble of adrenaline that followed the 3rd knock, he fumbled it up and started recording, capturing not the sound itself, which had already stopped, but the immediate aftermath. His own unsteady breathing, Renee's voice asking if he'd heard that too, and beneath both of their voices, faint but unmistakable on playback later, a low rustling from somewhere in the grass below the balcony, moving, as best either of them could tell, away from the house and toward the tree line, at a pace too fast and too controlled to be the wind. It was the first hard evidence either of them had that something had been standing closer to that house than either of them wanted to think about, and it would not be the last. They went inside almost immediately after that, neither of them willing to say the word that was sitting in both their throats, and it wasn't until they were sitting at Marcus's kitchen table, with the lights on and the balcony door locked, that Renee finally said it. She said she didn't believe in ghosts either. She said she'd never once, in 41 years, had an experience that made her question that. And she said that whatever had just happened, she couldn't explain it, and that scared her more than any explanation would have. What followed over the next several weeks is, by Marcus's own account, the part of the story that still keeps him up at night more than the knocking itself does. Not one dramatic haunting, but a slow accumulation of small, deeply unsettling data points that neither he nor Renee could ever assemble into a satisfying picture, each one small enough to dismiss alone and impossible to dismiss together. There was the bird. Marcus noticed it first on the night of the knocking itself, a single unseen bird somewhere in the trees behind the fence line, whistling in a pattern that struck him as wrong in a way he couldn't articulate at the time. Too rapid, too insistent, cycling through the same 3 or 4 notes over and over, with none of the natural variation birdsong usually has. He hadn't thought much of it in the moment, filed it away as background noise the way you file away a car alarm 3 streets over. It was only in retrospect, once he started paying attention, that he realized the bird, or something that sounded exactly like it, seemed to appear specifically in the minutes before anything else happened. He began, almost against his will, to think of it as a kind of warning bell, though he was careful never to say that out loud to Renee, worried that giving voice to a superstition would be the thing that made it real. There were nights after that when he'd catch, at the very edge of his vision, a suggestion of movement near the tree line that resolved into nothing when he looked at it directly. Not the shape from the dining room, nothing as distinct as that. Just a wrongness in the darkness at the property's edge that made the hair on his arms rise before his conscious mind had caught up. There was an evening, 3 weeks after the knocking, when the motion sensor light at the northeast corner of the yard, the one nearest the section of fence backing onto the woods, began triggering at almost the same time every night. 11:47, then 11:46, then 11:48. For 11 consecutive nights, tripped by nothing his security camera could resolve into a shape, just a dark blur crossing at the very edge of the frame, moving in a straight line parallel to the fence, never approaching the house, never retreating, simply passing. Marcus did what any newly converted skeptic does. He researched. He found forums full of people describing nearly identical experiences. Shadow figures glimpsed and then denied by the rational mind. Structures knocked on by nothing. Birds behaving as though something had disturbed their patterns. And found himself oddly comforted and deeply disturbed in equal measure by how consistent the accounts were. How many strangers who had never spoken to each other kept landing on the same handful of details. He learned the term shadow person and felt faintly ridiculous even typing it into a search bar. A grown man with a mortgage and a 401k typing ghost story vocabulary into his phone at 1 a.m. He learned that some of the accounts described the phenomenon escalating. He learned that some of them described it stopping entirely, the way a storm passes. Marcus had no idea, walking into what would become the 63rd night, that it was about to end, or that the ending would be almost worse than anything that came before it. He didn't know it was the last night until enough time had passed afterward that he felt safe calling it that. Renee was there again. She'd taken to coming over more often since the knocking, an unspoken solidarity between them that neither had to name, and they were sitting on the back deck, not the balcony, because by then, neither of them much cared to be directly beneath that stretch of gutter after dark. The bird started up in the trees, that same rapid, wrong cycling of notes, and Marcus felt the old prickle of dread settle over his shoulders. Renee went quiet beside him, and then, from somewhere out past the fence line, past the reach of even the brightest of his floodlights, came a single knock. Not 3, just one, distant, muffled by the trees, striking something that might have been wood, might have been metal, might have been nothing at all, and then silence, total and complete, the bird cutting off mid-note as though something had reached out and switched it off. They never heard from it again after that night. Marcus still doesn't know what to call what happened to him, still refuses the words that would make him comfortable dismissing it, and equally refuses the words that would make him comfortable accepting it. He keeps the video on his phone, the 90 seconds of unsteady footage from that first night of knocking, and he's shown it to exactly 4 people, none of whom have offered him an explanation he finds satisfying. What he tells people now, when they ask him what he believes happened, is that he's stopped needing an answer. He says the not knowing used to feel unbearable, and now it just feels like a fact about his house, the way some people live with an odd draft in one room, or a stair that always creaks on the 4th step. He still installs floodlights for a living, professionally, competently, and without a trace of irony. He just doesn't tell his clients why he's gotten so particular about coverage at the corners. Lorraine Beckett still keeps a log by her back door, one she started filling in years ago and has never once thrown away, because it's the only proof she has that what happened on her 11 acres wasn't something her mind built out of exhaustion and isolation. What's written in it isn't the frightening part. The frightening part is the gouges she found underneath her own porch, 3 of them, cut upward into solid lumber in a spot where nothing on earth should have been able to reach. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why a woman who has spent 11 years walking calmly toward gunshot wounds and cardiac arrests now cannot stand on her own porch when the crickets suddenly go silent. Lorraine Beckett has never once, in 11 years of night shift emergency nursing, walked away from a trauma bay shaking. She has packed gunshot wounds, called time of death on children, and driven home afterward without so much as raising her pulse. So when she tells this story, she tells it the way she'd give a report to an oncoming shift. Flat, precise, timestamps first. Because that clinical distance is the only thing that still lets her get through it without her hands starting to tremble again. She is 44. She lives alone on 11 acres outside a small town in the Vermont Hill Country, in a farmhouse she inherited from an aunt, chosen specifically for the silence. She will tell you the silence is the thing she misses most now, because for one autumn, the silence itself became the warning sign, and she has never since been able to enjoy quiet the way she used to. It didn't start with anything she saw. It started with something she didn't hear. Lorraine's farmhouse sat at the end of a half-mile gravel drive, isolated enough that the property came alive every night with a specific, reliable chorus. Crickets in the tall grass near the barn, a chorus of spring peepers down by the drainage pond, and somewhere in the tree line, a single whippoorwill that had called on and off through the warm months since she'd moved in. So consistent she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a refrigerator hum. It was the last week of September, cool enough that most of the insect noise had already died down for the season, when she came in from checking the chicken coop one evening and realized, standing on her back steps, that something about the yard felt wrong, and it took her almost a full minute of turning it over before she identified what it was. Nothing was making noise. Not the whippoorwill, not the wind through the corn stubble in the neighboring field, not even the low electrical hum of her own barn light. The entire property had gone perfectly, unnaturally silent, the way a hospital hallway goes silent in the half-second before a code is called. She stood there for a long moment with the empty feed bucket still in her hand, telling herself it was nothing, an early frost maybe, pushing the last of the insects into dormancy all at once, and went inside without looking too hard at the tree line. She had no idea yet that the silence itself was the first warning, or that it would take on a shape she could never have predicted before autumn was over. She didn't think about it again until 3 nights later, when the same silence fell, this time while she was sitting in her kitchen with the back door open for the cool air. And this time, she noticed something else along with it, a smell drifting in through the screen, faint but distinct, wet and mineral, like a well that had been opened after years of being sealed. She got up and closed the door. She told herself it was groundwater, or a septic issue, or something equally boring that she'd deal with in daylight, and she did not sleep well. The knocking came a week after that, and by the time it did, Lorraine had already quietly mentioned the silence to her neighbor, an 81-year-old widower named Walt Hendry, who farmed the adjoining parcel and who she'd built a comfortable, low-key friendship with over the 2 years she'd lived there. The kind of relationship built on borrowed tools and shared produce rather than any real intimacy, which was exactly why she trusted his reaction. Walt hadn't laughed at her. He'd gone quiet himself, in a way she found more unsettling than if he had laughed, and said only that he'd farmed that land his whole life, and that some falls were quieter than others, and left it at that. She hadn't pressed him. She wishes now that she had. Walt was over at the farmhouse the night of the knocking, helping her load firewood onto the back porch before the first hard freeze, both of them working under a string of shop lights she'd hung along the eave the previous winter, bright enough that the whole side yard was lit like a loading dock. They'd just set the last cord down when the silence dropped over the property again, so absolute and so sudden that both of them straightened up at the same moment, without either having said a word. And Walt, who Lorraine had never once seen rattled by anything in 2 years of knowing him, went very still and told her to get inside, which was the moment she understood, with total certainty, that whatever was coming was about to be worse than anything the silence alone had prepared her for. She didn't get inside. She stood on the porch steps, irrationally certain that whatever was happening needed a witness. And it was in that stillness that the porch railing beside her hand received a single, heavy blow from underneath. Not a knock in the sense of knuckles on wood, but a deep, structural impact, as though something had struck the underside of the porch decking itself with enough force to make the boards jump beneath her feet. It happened twice more in quick succession, each strike landing at a different point along the porch's length, moving away from her toward the far end where the decking met open ground. And there was no possible way, she has checked 100 times since, for anything to be underneath that porch. It sat on a poured concrete slab with no crawl space, no gap larger than 2 inches between the joists and the ground. Walt got her inside that time. They sat at a kitchen table with every light in the house on, and it was Walt, not Lorraine, who eventually broke the silence, telling her, reluctantly, the words coming out of him like something physically difficult to produce, that his own grandfather had described something similar happening on that same stretch of land back in the 1950s, before the farmhouse had even been built, and that the family had always referred to it obliquely, if at all, as the quiet, and had always treated a fall like this one as something to simply wait out rather than investigate. He didn't offer her an explanation because, he said plainly, he'd never had one, and neither had his grandfather. What he offered instead was a warning. Don't go looking for it. Whatever it is, it seems to leave people alone who leave it alone. Lorraine did not take that advice, not entirely. She was, after all, a woman who spent her professional life walking directly toward the worst thing in the room, and something in her couldn't simply wait out a mystery sitting under her own porch. Over the following month, she began keeping a log, the way she'd log vitals on a chart: date, time, temperature, wind conditions, whether the silence fell, and for how long, and the pattern she found unsettled her more than a random one would have. The silences were lengthening. What had been a single, unnerving minute in late September had, by the 3rd week of October, stretched to nearly 8 minutes at a time, the entire 11 acres holding its breath. And on 2 separate nights during that stretch, her chickens, usually silent themselves after dark, began shrieking in the coop with a panic she'd never heard from them before, calming only once the ordinary night sounds resumed. She found the marks on the underside of the porch decking by accident, checking for water damage after a hard rain in early November, and she has photographs of them still, though she has shown the photographs to almost no one. 3 parallel gouges, evenly spaced, cut into the pressure-treated lumber from below at an upward angle that made no structural sense. Nothing crawling along the ground could have struck upward into wood 2 inches above a concrete slab with that kind of leverage. Proof. The first physical proof she had, that whatever was under that porch shouldn't have been able to fit there at all. She had a contractor out the following week under the pretense of an unrelated repair and watched his face carefully when she pointed the marks out to him. He had no explanation either, and he seemed, she thought, faintly reluctant to keep looking at them. Neither of them knew, sitting down at that kitchen table one more time, that it would be the last night, or that the ending would arrive so gently it would almost feel like mercy. The quiet came for the last time on the night of the first real snow in the 2nd week of December, with Walt again at her kitchen table for what had become an unspoken ritual of checking on each other during the worst of it. The silence dropped, longer than it had ever lasted, long enough that Lorraine found herself timing it against the kitchen clock out of sheer nervous habit. And at the 9-minute mark, with snow falling silently past the porch light, there came one final impact against the decking, softer than the others, almost gentle by comparison. And then the ordinary sounds of the night came flooding back all at once. Wind, the tick of the cooling wood stove, somewhere far off, impossibly, the whippoorwill, calling as though nothing at all had happened. It has not come back, not in any form Lorraine can point to with confidence, though she still keeps her log by the back door out of habit, and she still notices, more than she'd like to admit, the exact moment each autumn when the crickets first go quiet for the season, holding her breath every time until the ordinary sounds return. Walt never did tell her anything more than what his grandfather had passed down, and the two of them have never fully discussed it since, as though naming it too many times might be its own kind of invitation. What Lorraine will say, if you ask her directly, is that 11 years of emergency medicine taught her there are things the body registers before the mind can explain them, and that whatever lived under her porch that fall taught her something similar about the land itself, that some silences are not the absence of anything at all, but the sound of something choosing, very deliberately, to be heard. Sarah Whitfield has spent 14 years photographing exactly what does and doesn't move through wild country, and she still has one photograph she cannot bring herself to delete or fully explain. It isn't gruesome. Nothing in it is even clearly visible. What makes it unbearable is the 8 seconds of empty trail immediately before it, proof that whatever the camera caught crossed 40 yards of open ground and arrived directly in front of the lens without triggering a single frame in between. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a woman who built her entire career on trusting evidence over instinct eventually packed up and left the land she loved, rather than spend one more season on it. Nobody who works with Sarah Whitfield would call her imaginative. She spent 14 years as a wildlife biologist for a state fish and game department outside Missoula, Montana, running population surveys on elk and black bear across a territory of a few thousand square miles. And her entire professional identity is built on distinguishing real animal sign from wishful thinking, the difference between an actual cougar track and a hiker's excited misidentification of a dog print. She is 39, unmarried, lives alone in a cabin at the end of a Forest Service road 20 minutes from the nearest paved highway, and has told this story exactly twice, both times to colleagues, both times prefacing it with the same sentence. She does not believe this was an animal, and she has spent months trying to prove herself wrong. It began, appropriately enough, with a trail camera, one of a dozen she had strapped to trees around her property that fall, part of an informal, personal survey she ran every year to track what moved through her land after the tourists cleared out. She checked the cards every 10 days or so, mostly expecting the usual catalog: deer, the occasional black bear working the last of the huckleberries, a bobcat that had denned somewhere on the ridge above her cabin for 2 winters running. What she found instead, on a single camera, on a single frame, time-stamped 11:52 p.m., was something she has spent an unreasonable number of hours since trying to explain, and has never once succeeded. The frame showed the trail lit in the flat gray wash of the camera's infrared flash, every blade of grass and pine needle rendered in sharp, clinical detail, and across the center of it, a shape. Not an animal shape, nothing with the proportions of anything four-legged, nothing with the silhouette of a person either, simply a vertical column of pure black, occupying roughly the space where a tall man might stand, with no visible texture, no reflective eye shine the way every animal on every other frame she'd ever captured produced, and no motion blur despite the trail camera's known tendency to blur anything moving faster than a slow walk. It looked, she has said more than once, less like something the camera had photographed and more like something the camera had failed to photograph, a gap in the image where information should have been. She almost deleted it, assuming a malfunction, and would have if she hadn't noticed the frame immediately before it, time-stamped 8 seconds earlier, showing the same empty trail with nothing on it at all, meaning whatever had produced the black column had covered 40 yards of open ground and arrived directly in front of a motion-triggered camera inside a single 8-second gap, without appearing on any frame in between. It was the detail that told her, before she'd admitted it to a single other person, that this was no longer something she could file away as equipment error. She didn't mention it to anyone for almost 3 weeks, running her own investigation in the meantime with the same rigor she'd bring to a disputed specimen, checking the camera's firmware for glitches, testing it against known animals, comparing the frame against years of her own archived footage for anything resembling it. She found nothing. It was her research partner, a fellow biologist named Colton Reyes, who she'd worked alongside for 6 years and trusted more than almost anyone in her professional life, who she finally showed the image to, expecting him to find the flaw in her thinking that she couldn't find herself. He didn't. He sat with the photo open on her laptop for nearly 10 minutes without saying anything, and when he finally spoke, it was to ask, carefully, whether anything else had happened on the property since. Once he asked, she realized several things had, though she'd been filing each one under separate, mundane explanations rather than connecting them. Her dog, a normally unbothered 10-year-old shepherd mix, had taken to refusing the back porch after dark for reasons she'd attributed to arthritis. The bobcat that had denned on the ridge for 2 winters had not shown up on a single camera all season, a gap in the data she'd chalked up to relocation. And on 3 separate nights over the previous month, she had woken at almost the exact same time, somewhere between 3:10 and 3:20, with no clear reason, simply awake, lying still and listening to a cabin that offered nothing to listen to. Colton came out to the property the following weekend, ostensibly to help her reposition cameras for better coverage, and they spent the better part of a Saturday setting up a denser grid around the cabin than she'd ever run before. 6 cameras instead of 2 along that stretch of fence line, angled to eliminate any possible blind spot the way you'd cover a trail if you were genuinely trying to catch something, rather than simply document what wandered through. They sat up late that night on her porch, coffee gone cold, neither of them quite willing to say out loud what they were actually hoping the cameras would or wouldn't catch. A question that would get answered sooner than either of them expected. It was well past midnight when Sarah's dog, curled at her feet, lifted his head and let out a low, continuous growl aimed at a section of dark tree line that the porch light didn't quite reach. Neither of them saw anything. That was, Sarah says now, almost the worst part. That whatever the dog was reacting to gave them nothing to react to in turn. No shape, no sound, no motion at the edge of the light. Just her dog's hackles standing fully upright and a growl that didn't stop for nearly 4 full minutes before subsiding as abruptly as it had started. They checked the cameras the following week and found, across all 6 units, a scattering of ordinary wildlife footage and exactly one more anomalous frame. Not the black column this time, but a section of the fence line, in a single still, showing every blade of grass along a 2-foot stretch, bent flat toward the ground in a pattern with no visible point of origin, as though something had settled there briefly and left without disturbing anything on either side. Sarah spent the following 2 months running what amounted to a full scientific investigation into her own backyard, and she'll tell you plainly that it's the only project of her career that ended without a conclusion. She tested every camera for malfunction and found none. She researched infrared photography anomalies and found explanations that accounted for some cases like hers, and conspicuously failed to account for the missing 8 seconds of footage or the 4 minutes of her dog's unbroken growling at nothing. She read, against her own professional instincts, into the kind of paranormal literature she would have dismissed outright a year earlier, and found, uncomfortably, that hunters and field biologists in isolated country had been describing some version of her black column for longer than trail cameras had existed, under a dozen different names, in regions that had no reason to be trading stories with each other. The activity never escalated into anything more dramatic than what those first weeks produced. No second knocking, no direct sighting, nothing that crossed the threshold from unsettling to explicitly threatening, but it also never fully stopped, not in the clean way she'd hoped it might. Through the winter, at increasingly wide intervals, her cameras would occasionally return a single anomalous frame, always at night, always along that same stretch of fence line, always gone from the very next frame with no transition captured in between. Her dog stopped sleeping on the back porch entirely and took up a permanent post at the foot of her bed instead. The bobcat never returned. The bobcat never returned. And by spring, none of the previous winter's small, unresolved wrongnesses had prepared Sarah for the decision she'd eventually make about the land she'd chosen specifically because she loved it. By spring, Sarah had made a decision that surprised even her, given how much of her identity was built around never fleeing what she couldn't explain. She requested a transfer to a different survey territory 200 miles east, citing professional reasons to her supervisors that weren't the real reasons, and she sublet the cabin rather than selling it outright, unable to fully commit to either staying near it or cutting ties with it completely. She still has the original photograph. She still, on the rare occasions she visits colleagues who ask her to tell the story, refuses to say definitively what she believes it shows, only that in 14 years of documenting exactly what does and doesn't move through wild country, it remains the only frame she's ever captured that she cannot, in good conscience, call anything at all.